Hey, this is Adam Tomasi with Champion Briefs, and today I'll be doing the September-October LD topic analysis. The resolution is resolved. In the United States, colleges and universities ought not consider standardized tests in undergraduate admissions decisions. So this resolution is important because today, as a lot of you are in the college admissions process, over 900 schools in the United States are test optional, including my alma mater, Wake Forest University. Whereas one college, Hampshire College in Massachusetts, is test averse, meaning that they don't look at the test scores at all. Test optional schools give you the ability to submit a score if you got a high one. But if you didn't get that great of a score, you can choose not to submit it, and you'll be put into a separate applicant pool and be evaluated on other considerations like GPA, extracurriculars, letters of recommendation, and so on. And the reason why these schools joined the test optional movement is because they looked at the research that said that standardized tests such as the SAT were inhibitors to diversity, and that they were a barrier to students from disadvantaged communities. And because their goal was to increase the diversity of their applicants, they wanted to de-emphasize standardized tests. They also looked at research that found that the SAT may not be as accurate of a predictor of college success, such as first-year college GPA, as the College Board claims. So they ultimately decided that the tests should not be the end-all of a student's college admission and whether or not they get into a school. Other colleges have chosen to continue emphasizing standardized test scores where you know that you do have to get a certain score in order to get into particular schools. So the topic is really asking whether any school should consider standardized test scores, period. Not whether they should be test optional, but whether they should be like Hampshire College and not consider the tests at all. So to enlighten those who may not be in this intense college admissions process on what all of these tests are, the standardized test that's most prevalent in the literature, most popular, most well-known, is the SAT. It was founded in 1926. It used to be called the Scholastic Aptitude Test. 11th and 12th graders are the ones that traditionally take it or take it again and again and again. And it was founded by Dr. Carl Brigham, who was a eugenicist, which meant that he held the reprehensible belief that there were certain innate differences in human intelligence based upon race or ethnicity, and he had hoped repugnantly that his aptitude test would be a way of weeding out certain undesirable populations from institutions like universities and the army. 4 years after the founding of the test, he recanted his eugenicist beliefs and noted that there were no innate differences in human intelligence based on race or ethnicity. But many critics of the SAT today argue that the test still has a eugenic quality in terms of harmfully sorting out certain populations from higher education. So that is central to the debate about tests like the SAT, whether they mirror and magnify the inequalities that exist in our society today. So the SAT is now on a scale up to 1600. When the writing section was required, it was up to a scale of 2400, but now the essay is optional. The SAT also still measures reading and writing, reading and math, based on its changes since 2016. So before it was reading, math, and writing, now it's reading and math, which is also how the test used to be before they added an essay. There's also the PSAT, which is the preliminary SAT that many students take when they're sophomores in high school. In addition, you have the SAT subject tests. These are optional. There are 20 of them, ranging from literature to US and world history to biology, chemistry, and physics, and virtually every language that's taught in high schools today. All of this is administered now by the College Board, which, though it sounds like a public board of directors of colleges, it's a private company. You also have the ACT, that's administered by ACT Incorporated. That stands for American College Testing. It was founded in 1957. It's on a scale of 36, unlike 1600 with the SAT. And also, unlike the SAT, the ACT has a science section. There's another test called AccuPlacer. It's used by community colleges and career training schools to make sure that their students are ready for college level courses, and they can also take individual tests in math, reading, or writing in order to measure their readiness for those areas and also potential areas of improvement. Lastly, there's a new test called the CLT, or the Classical Learning Test. It was founded in 2015 by Classic Learning Initiatives. It's on a scale up to 120. It has similar categories to the SAT, but it includes things like logical reasoning and grammar. It's online, it's not paper-based, and it's intended as an alternative for homeschooled students or kids from alternative learning environments. There are also 2 English language proficiency tests. There's TOEFL and there's the IELTS, which are intended for international students coming to English-speaking universities in the United States, where college admissions offices want to see how strong their English is before they admit students from other countries. And that's also intended as a floor for all of these students to be admitted, because students from all different parts of the world may have different grading systems. So students are encouraged to even take the SAT in order to get into an American school. But TOEFL and the IELTS are also some other examples of that package of tests that are required. So there are so many standardized tests to be considered here, but the affirmative has to argue that none of those tests should be considered in college and university admissions decisions, which shouldn't be too hard to do given how strong the literature is on why standardized tests are not effective, but you have to be wary of the negative going for a plan-inclusive counterplan or a pick to argue that we should draw an exception at, say, TOEFL, or maybe the SAT is uniquely better than the ACT. ACT is better than the SAT. The negative could argue that there are certain unique benefits and advantages of particular tests, and the affirmative has to be ready to go on that debate. One other important change with the SAT today is the adversity score. The College Board is piloting this with some schools now in response to criticism that the SAT mirrors and magnifies generational inequalities across race, class, gender, and ethnicity due to the fact that it poses a very high barrier to students that come from less well-resourced high schools and other particular backgrounds, meaning that the score gaps are also going to translate into less diverse colleges and universities in the long run if the tests become the end-all of whether a student gets admitted. So the College Board is looking at a scale of 100 to 0, where 100 is least hardship, and the score is only visible to the schools that receive a student's scores. So the student doesn't get to contribute their own information as to the adversity they've experienced. Instead, the College Board is looking at publicly available data about both the neighborhood in which an individual resides and also their high school to look at average levels of college attendance, family stability, median income, housing stability, like how many properties are vacant or rentals, also looking at educational levels as well as crime. And doing this in order to look at the overall social environment in which a student resides in order to give context to the test. Now, the schools receive with this adversity score an environmental context dashboard, which also looks at the percentile of a student's score relative to their peers in their high school, and also other information about that high school, like their AP opportunities, and also how many kids received free or reduced lunches, in order for the school to be able to read beyond the number and look at how a traditionally lower score might reflect the adversities that a student has experienced, where if they did not experience that adversity, they probably would have got a higher score. The College Board also notifies the school of how that student's adversity measures with the institutional average of adversity of the students that the college admits. So if the college is looking to increase its racial or socioeconomic diversity, those all may be helpful statistics for them. However, the affirmative can draw on the literature that argues that the adversity score may actually magnify inequalities because according to Jane Hu from Slate, it's an algorithmic black box. In other words, students have no idea how these scores are actually measured, even though the College Board claims they have certain indicators. They don't know how the indicators add up to produce an average. It's possible that the adversity score may understate the disadvantages that a minority student experiences, even though they may live in a wealthier or low crime neighborhood, or even though they may be at an excellent high school. They may still get lower scores. They may still have accumulated disadvantages that the College Board is not measuring. And the students really have no opportunity to correct those scores or submit their own data, meaning that, as that Slate article quotes from various education professors and scholars, that the adversity score may be ineffective at resolving these inequalities. So that may lend way to an argument that says that standardized tests should not be considered at all, and that the College Board is only pursuing Band-Aid solutions, because the problem is the tests themselves. So with all of those changes in mind and the fine-grained details of these standardized tests, we'll now consider 5 different types of affirmatives and 5 different types of negative positions. So one affirmative, the Rawls affirmative, based on the political philosophy of John Rawls, argues that if we were to design our society from scratch, we would prioritize equal basic liberties, and that any inequalities that exist would be justified from the perspective of the least well-off. Now, Rawls may support not considering standardized tests because they mirror and magnify the inequalities that I had discussed, and this is validated by many statistics for the affirmative. So you could argue that in order to construct a fair and equal society and to rectify these legacies of, say, racism, sexism, xenophobia, structural inequality along class lines from capitalism, that we need to stop considering the tests. Of course, the negative can argue that the problem is not the tests themselves. The problem is the background conditions that inhibit effective test prep. So by making test prep free, by making the test itself free and paid for by colleges for you to take it the first time, by addressing funding gaps across school districts, we would be able to rectify the inequalities that exist within the scores. However, I don't think that the negative would have the ability to argue for all of those reforms to education more broadly, or to how the tests are written, because the actor of the resolution is admissions offices, who don't have the ability to make all of those societal decisions. So I think it would be unfair for the negative to argue that, instead we should have the government step in and make these changes, because the government is not the actor of the resolution. The affirmative is only limited to what admissions offices can do. So the negative would be able to do double or triple, and then the debate would be moot. So that's one affirmative on this topic that's probably going to be the most popular, because some of the best affirmative literature is about these inequalities and the unfairnesses of the SAT. Another affirmative would be based in virtue ethics, the Aristotelian philosophy about human flourishing based on living as a virtuous person. This emphasizes moral education, and you could argue that as colleges shift to holistic review, where they look at the whole person or the whole candidate for their school, that they would be encouraging valuable character traits in an individual that you find from letters of recommendation, extracurriculars like community service, etc., and to indicate that people are more than a test. Of course, the negative could argue that admissions offices aren't really qualified to make these moral judgments about a person, and that it would become quite subjective for them to do that. There's also a Kantian affirmative based upon our absolute moral duties rooted in our lives as free and rational persons, and arguing that the SAT is riddled with fraud and cheating, and that we have a moral obligation to never be deceitful toward others, meaning that the tests are a corrupt instrument and should not be used, and that the colleges should find their own more honest indicators, such as GPA, which may be harder to manipulate, though the negative could also say that grade inflation means that GPA is also fraudulent, and that colleges would then have a catch-22 situation. So they may have to look at other considerations besides how much cheating there is, if it's an inevitable fact of the educational process. But of course, the affirmative could argue the SAT is unique in this respect. Another affirmative would be a pragmatist or utilitarian affirmative, which would say that the SAT is counterproductive toward achieving its goals because there are studies that show that it fails to adequately predict a student's success, whether in terms of first-year college GPA or in terms of how well they do later in life, like whether they even graduate or how much income they make. And lastly, the existentialism affirmative, which would say that standardized tests are not conducive to authentic critical thinking because the student is not choosing what they want to learn. They're rather being handed a standardized curriculum. And then the way that their educational environment goes, you have learning to the test as well as teaching to the test. So it becomes doubly inauthentic for the student, who then doesn't get to carve out their own unique learning environment. Of course, the negative can say that there are tests in all walks of life and at every stage in the educational experience, from high school exit exams to even standardized tests you get in 4th and 8th grade. So ultimately, there's no avoiding that problem for the affirmative. But still, nonetheless, a set of unique affirmative positions and lots of credible literature on that side. There are also 5 negative positions that are worth discussing. First would be negative about the institutional mission of schools. This sort of functions like a plan-inclusive counterplan because you would be towing the line of saying that some schools can ignore the tests, but other schools should not. And you'd be appealing to the philosophy of a functional ought. Just say that our obligations are relative to the role we have in society, and ultimately that the role of admissions offices should be based upon the institutional mission of the school. So if you have a school like Hampshire College, which is very unstructured, they're admitting students basically into a graduate school environment, they're already critical thinkers, and it's a much smaller liberal arts-based school, test scores don't really matter to them, which is why they can ignore them. But if you have a large public university, it may be more useful for them to have test scores, not only to get through very large applicant pools, but also because they may care about testing for those basic proficiencies in reading, writing, math, etc., in order for the particular group of students that they're trying to prepare, or for the purpose of their college ranking, etc., and other factors. So this would argue that we should not have a one-size-fits-all solution on the question of tests. Of course, the affirmative could argue that under no college's mission should they be using an ineffective indicator of student success, and that the standardized tests, because they're ineffective at predicting student success, should not be used under any school's mission. And the negative will have to argue with their own studies that the SAT does actually predict how well a student is going to do later in life or how well they'll do in college. There's also the test optional counterplan. So the negative can argue that every school should be test optional instead of test averse. And they could say that's the best of both worlds because the SAT could still be an effective data point for the colleges that do care about it. But students who don't submit their scores from diverse backgrounds could still get admitted. And then schools could increase diversity while maintaining the same GPA levels. There's also a virtue ethics position along similar lines where you would argue that the most important trait in a virtuous person is practical wisdom. So you want to make sure that students are trained in basic skills like reading, math, and writing. Of course, the affirmative could argue that students don't exist in a vacuum and that we shouldn't be buying into this myth of meritocracy where students have innate capabilities in reading, math, or writing, or that we should utterly neglect students who may not be as proficient in those areas because the goal of education is to be constantly helping students get to a better point of knowledge. So we shouldn't be as strict in the admissions process and use the tests as an arbitrary cutoff. There's also an economy disadvantage. So you could argue again that the SAT, because or other tests even, the SAT is the most popular and prevalent in all of the cards you're going to look at. It's the core of the debate. But thinking more generally with standardized tests, you could argue that they prepare an effective workforce, maybe even in STEM fields, and that that's conducive to the overall health of the national economy. And then lastly, there's the deschooling critique. So deschooling is a concept that comes from Ivan Illich, who wrote a book in 1971 called Deschooling Society. And he argues that compulsory public education only breeds conformity because it doesn't allow students themselves to decide what they're going to learn. And he argued that we should decenter the role of brick and mortar schools with, at that time, the new and burgeoning technologies that he saw even in 1971 to allow for peer-to-peer networks where students can basically choose electives all throughout their life on what they would like to learn. So he argues that rather than having a system where even if you get rid of standardized tests, which he wasn't writing about, but for the sake of argument, even if you ignore standardized tests, you're still looking at things like GPA or curriculum or APs, which are very standardized. So if the affirmative is saying we shouldn't teach the test, we should have authentic learning experiences, the negative is taking the more radical position that says that the conclusion of this is to reject the whole premise of institutionalized schooling. Of course, while this does have a strategic value of going even farther than the affirmative is not in too bad of a spot by arguing that public schools are valuable and play an important role in our society, meaning that we shouldn't throw those out as we get rid of standardized tests in college and university admissions. So in conclusion, there are a lot of really valuable arguments on both sides of this topic. There's actually a lot to debate about, even though it seems like a very small subject compared to some of the larger, more worldly topics that we've had in recent years. But I do think it's an excellent debate, and it could be hashed out endlessly. I'll have 3 concluding notes. First is you always want to look at the studies that all of the opinion pieces about the SAT that you find are referencing, because those studies, whether from economists or education professors, are going to be very filled with important detail. So it's worth checking those out because then you can kind of read between the lines of how a study got to its particular data and then have a more effective argument to make when you're comparing studies about the relative utility of standardized tests or whether or not getting rid of a consideration for the tests would increase diversity or not, which gets debated out even by economists. There are excellent studies here that all these pieces are summarizing and relying on to make their arguments. Second is you again have to be wary of all of these negative counterplans because there are cases to be made that the negative shouldn't get to make a utopian case for a completely redesigned standardized test that's so fantastic that the affirmative can have no objections to it because that makes the debate moot. Lastly, I think it's worth getting creative about how you apply philosophy to these cases, because even though the standardized tests may not seem like an ethical subject, there are, as you've seen from these affirmative and negative ideas, ways to creatively apply the philosophies that debaters are acquainted with, like utilitarianism, Kantianism, Rawlsianism, and so on, to this subject of admissions offices and the decisions that they ought to be making. Because it is an applied ethical question of taking abstract philosophy and applying it to a concrete situation that affects all high school students today as they're going through this complex college admissions process. So that's all I have for you today. I'm Adam Tomasi with Champion Briefs, and thank you so much for listening. Also, definitely check out our briefs because we have excellent research on both sides of hundreds of pages of great cards. And with those briefs, you can jump right into your practice speeches, your practice debates, and even an entire tournament with the knowledge that you need to do well in your debates. So thank you so much.